Now we're going to animate our character's eye's position. We can close our other layers. We'll select our eye layer, press P to bring up the position. Press the stopwatch to put a keyframe on frame 32. Now we'll move over to frame 36. We'll drag our X position to around 180. So now our character looks to the right. Now let's move over to frame 42. Press the keyframe button to put a keyframe because we don't want any animation between those two keyframes. Now we'll move to frame 46. We'll move our X position to around 140. So now our character looks over to the left. This is what we have so far. We'll move to frame 52, press the keyframe button. Move to frame 56. This time we'll move our Y position down to 235. Now our character is looking down. Move over to frame 64, press the keyframe button so that there's no animation between those 2 points. And now let's move to frame 69 and copy and paste our first keyframe. So we go back to the original position. Here's what we have so far. To make the animation smoother, we're going to select our keyframes, press F9, head into the graph editor. For our first 3 animations, we're going to drag our keyframes to the left to have a fast animation. And for the last animation, we're going to keep it at the default ease so that the eyes have a smoother transition back into the final resting place. And there we go, this is what we have so far. Now we're going to animate our eyebrows, nose, and mouth. First, let's head to a point on the timeline where there's no animation. Frame 70. We'll create a new null object by going to Layer, New, Null Object. Let's rename it Face Controls. Remember to press Enter to rename a layer. Now we're going to connect our eyebrows, mouth, and nose to our new Face Controls layer. And we'll connect our Face Controls layer to our head. Now let's start animating. On the Face Controls layer, we'll press P to bring up the position. Let's bring up our eye keyframes, just for reference. Remember to press U on the keyboard to bring up the keyframes. On frame 32, we'll press the stopwatch to put a keyframe. We'll move to our next eye position. Now let's change the X position of our face controls. We'll drag over our X position. Let's try 185. We'll move to our next eye position. Press the keyframe button because we don't want any animation between those 2 keyframes. Move to our next eye position. Now let's drag our X position back. Around 160 looks good. Move to our next eye position. Press the keyframe button. Again, move to our next eye position. This time we're going to change our Y position. Let's try 300. Move to our next eyes position. Press the keyframe button. And finally, we'll move to our final resting position. And we'll copy and paste our first keyframe to go back to the original position. Now let's select our keyframes, press F9 to easy ease, head into the graph editor. Remember, I'm using the speed graph. For the first 3 handles, I'm going to drag them all the way to the left. And then I'm going to leave the 4th as the default. Let's preview what that looks like. we're going to have our ears move in the opposite direction of the rest of the character's face. So let's keep our eyes and positions open, just for reference. And we'll open up our ears position by pressing P on the keyboard. We'll move to our first eye position. Press the stopwatch on the ears to put a keyframe. Move to our next eye position. Now we're going to drag our X position in the opposite direction of our eyes. Somewhere around 158. Now let's move to our next eye position. Press the keyframe button. Again, move to our next eye position. And we'll drag our X position in the opposite direction. Around 172. Move to our next eye position. Press the keyframe button. Move to our next eye position again. This time we're going to drag our Y position on the ears to around 210. We'll move to our next eye keyframe. Press the keyframe button on our ears. And finally, we'll move to the last keyframe on our eyes, and we'll copy and paste the first keyframe on our ear layer. Select the keyframes, press F9 to easy ease. And again, we're going to ease these keyframes in a similar way to our earlier animations. We'll pull the first 3 animations to the left, and leave the last one as the default. There we go. So the first thing we're going to animate is our character blinking as she comes onto the screen. With our eye layer selected, press the S key to bring up the scale. We're going to check the unlink button. Place a keyframe at the beginning of the timeline. Let's move over to frame 10 on the timeline. And we'll shrink our Y property to 15%. Now let's move over to frame 15. Change our value back to 100. Select our keyframes, press F9 to easy ease. Our second eye blink, we'll start it at frame 28, press the keyframe button. Move over to frame 32. Again, put our Y value to 15%. Move over to frame 36. Change our value back to 100. And our third eye blink, we'll start at frame 64. Press the keyframe button. Move over to frame 68. Change our Y value to 15. Move to frame 72. And we'll change our value back to 100. In part 1 of the hair animation, we're going to animate our character's hair as she animates onto the screen. Let's select our hair front layer. Press R to bring up the rotation. Let's move to frame 7 on the timeline. Press the stopwatch to put a keyframe. Now let's move to frame 16. Let's change our rotation value to a negative number, maybe -7. I'll turn off the hair back so we can see what we're doing better. Now let's move to frame 23. Change our rotation value to a positive number, +5. We'll move to frame 26. Type in a negative number, maybe -2. And finally, we'll go to frame 29 and we'll change our value back to 0%. Now let's see what that looks like. Now you can see the hair swinging back and forth. Let's select our keyframes, press F9 to easy ease. I'm going to use the speed graph editor. For our first handles, we'll drag them all the way to the left. And for the remainder of the animations, I'm going to pull the handles into the middle. There we go. Now we're going to do the same thing for the hair back layer. We're essentially going to do the exact same animation. So let's head back to our first hair front keyframe. Let's click on our hair back layer, bring up the rotation by pressing the R. Press the keyframe button. Let's move to our second hair front keyframe. And we'll change our rotation to a negative number, maybe -5. I think that looks good enough. Now let's move to the next hair front keyframe. Change our hair back value to a positive number, +3. Again, let's move to our next hair front keyframe. Change our rotation to a negative number. And finally, let's go to our last hair front keyframe. And we'll change our hair back rotation value to 0. We'll easy ease our keyframes with F9, head into the graph editor. And we're going to do a very similar easing as we did with our hair front layer. And this is what we have so far.